Welcome back, everybody. This is Will Bezard coming to you in Rhino space via the internet. I'm glad that you could join me again, as I'm very excited to be going over some of these details of the Rhino program with you. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the basic setup involved with Rhino, something that I neglected to share previously in our videos. I do realize that if you're not aware with the basic functions of the program, it can be a bit difficult to get to the point where we're drawing even basic shapes. So one of the first things that we will do is go up to the toolbar. I'm not even sure if Rhino calls it that, but we're going to open our tools, drop down window, and hit options. Now, annotation styles is pretty important when we're using dimension command. So I like to go ahead and make a new one, and I've edited it already. The main thing that we want to look at is our length in units and our linear resolution. This is going to allow us to use the dimension command and actually measure things down to a particular accuracy. I've never really seen a reason to work beyond 1,000th of an inch, but we can go much more accurate than that if we want to. I also like to increase the resolution of the angular units, which can be helpful, like when I draw a D-scale fretboard and the end of the fretboard is a really odd angle and I'm trying to rotate a pickup to line up with the end of the fretboard while staying on center. So we need to do that, and we need to look at our units and make sure that our model units are set up in inches if that's what we're using. But I mean, you can work in any scale and any metric that you might want to be using. So for instance, if we're drawing plans for a house, we might use feet. So we've got that. Our display precision is consistent with our dimensions in the annotation style, and that's what we got. I also like to turn off the grid because we don't really actually need it. Once I draw a line, that's going to be on the C-plane. The grid can be useful in orienting your general location, but if anything, I might just want to have my grid axes turned on. Then I can see that. But otherwise, that grid is just a whole bunch of superfluous information. You can draw in a way where you're snapping to the grid, but a lot of guitar shapes tend to be a little bit more freeform than that, and we can rely on some other tools, which I'll talk about in a moment, to make sure that our lines are perfectly straight and perpendicular to the quote-unquote world that we're drawing in. So since we've set up our annotations dialog correctly, if I type in a unit like 1.123, I'll enter that. I can hit dimension, measure it end to end, and bingo, we've got exactly what we're looking for. So it's definitely got to be the first step in setting it up. If you don't do that, you draw something, send it to somebody for them to cut it or print it or anything like that, then it's going to be a completely different size than you intend it to be, and that's not a good time for anybody involved. The next thing I think that we can talk about is our toolbars, right? Some people like to use the toolbars. I'm at a point where I've memorized just about every command that I'm going to use, and I'm really fast with the keyboard, so I prefer to type them. But if you don't prefer to do that, so you can interact with this in a way that you might interact with Photoshop, where we're going to get, let's see, point is a useful one, mesh creation tools, and let's just also put in curve drawing. Okay, now these are popped up, and we can stick them on here to wherever we want to put them. Well, sometimes they're a little bit of a pain to move to be actually where we want them to be, but this is something I choose not to do or interact with because, like I said, I have them all memorized. But if you don't have them memorized, it can be a good way to solidify it in your memory by having it here. I've talked a lot about how the command window works in some of my previous videos as well, but this will also give you the same inputs that typing your command in would give you, and so we can just click and not even really use our keyboard at all. Curve degree, let's make it a 4-degree curve. So this is where we can kind of edit this thing, and we've drawn a shape. So the reason I don't like to use these very much is that I feel like they take up some amount of real estate, and I want to be able to see everything in my window as much as I can. So I'm going to get rid of these, get them out of here. Also, for these kinds of videos, people can see more if I open up some real estate. I think the next good thing to talk about would probably be our viewports. By default, Rhino has a top orientation, a front orientation, a right side orientation, and a perspective. This is great if you have one screen. On my computer at home, I have 3. So what I like to do is I have copied my perspective window to the other screen, and now I can drag it in here. And so this is what I see on my right hand screen. I just always have the perspective up. And this helps me quite a bit because I have like one screen is just for 3D space, and this main screen is just for drawing and kind of 2D space. Now, 3 tools I want to talk about are OSnap. If you look at the bottom on this toolbar here, we have OSnap, Ortho, and Gumball. I like all 3 of these quite a bit. Ortho is very important. When it is, and let's say I go to draw a line, it's going to snap to perpendicular directions wherever I go. So I can only make right angles, right? You can turn this off by clicking on Ortho or typing Ortho. Or if you begin a command and you want to, in the middle of it, not be using Ortho, you can hold Shift and suddenly you can freeform and move around. Okay, and then we have OSnap. OSnap's great. If I click on it here, you can see that on the bottom left, these little dialogues become grayed out. But when it's on, it's exactly what you might assume. Rhino is put together very logically. It's if something looks like it says something, it probably does what it's saying it does. OSnap will cause your cursor to snap to any of these points on an object. So if I draw a line and I go to draw a new line, since we have the end near to the object, the middle point, and some of the others, it will snap. And then when it does that, it tells me right here, end. I know that I'm snapped to the end. If I move to the middle, I know I'm snapped to the middle. So this can cut out a lot of the busy work, that you would probably have to do if you were drafting something by hand. You would have to, if you were drawing this by hand, you'd have to physically measure this line and find the center point and do all that. You don't have to think about that with Rhino, which is beautiful. It's incredibly helpful in multiple different situations. And you're going to see that in action in all of the videos that I do. In fact, I'm fairly certain that you see me use them in the previous videos, and I am also pretty sure that I mentioned it briefly, but I thought it would be prudent to mention it in depth. The next one is Gumball, which is relatively limited. In fact, sometimes it's just in the way. So when I click on this object or select what I'm working with, you see these arrows come up and some quarter circles. I think it's great in the perspective window because I can very quickly move things across a fixed axis, or I can rotate them 90 degrees or 180 degrees. I mean, it's snapping that way on the rotation because Ortho is on. If I grab this and then hold Shift, I can rotate it freeform. But if I'm making fixtures or like drawing something and I have to flip it quickly, I'm just going to grab it and flip it just like that. And actually, this will give us a better sense of perspective if I have something moving in 3D. So I grab this and boom, boom. But it also won't rotate it on a point that you might want to be rotating it on. It's just going to grab it on its true center point and do that. But it can be really quick, really handy if I need to very quickly change the orientation of something. I'm also realizing that I need to back up just a tiny bit and talk about the viewport modifiers that there are here. When we click on this arrow and we get this drop down window, we can choose between different display types. We can see a print preview, adjust what we're looking at. This shows us some camera controls. We can change the view. So if we don't want to be looking at it from the top anymore, we want to see it from the bottom, we can do that. Although I've very rarely had situations where I needed to do that. We can change where the C-plane is, but the C-plane is very important. Generally, when I'm drawing something, I like that to be my Z0 point, or synonymous with the Z0 point of the table of the machine that I'm drawing to put things on. that can be very handy in situations where, like, let's say I have this shape and I've drawn it in kind of a strange way, but I know that the, dimensions are correct, but I want it to be flat. This is very not flat right now, right? I can select this and type in project to C plane, and that projects it to my Z0 point. I found this to be really helpful when I'm machining something and I've got this complex guitar shape and I've, placed it on a virtual version of the fixture, and I need to simply snap a new registration point to the top of the fixture, which many times is the 0 point. I can just select that thing and type in project to C plane. It hops down there, and I know that it's directly in line with the Z axis. It hasn't moved across the X or Y, and it's now on the 0 point of the C plane. That's super handy. We also have a shortcut to our grid options. So if we want to turn the grid back on, we can do that. Something I forgot to mention earlier is that having the grid can give you a better reference for your orientation. As you can see now, it's probably, we could say that it's more difficult to lose track of your orientation in the program. So those are a few basic things. What I can do now is draw a rectangle or a little cube, and this is a longhand way. I mean, I could have just used a rectangle command, but old habits die hard, as they say. I'm going to extrude this into a little cube, and you can see an indicator in this current view that this is a 3D object is the bold lines. If it was just a 2D object, we would see, thinner lines. In fact, I can duplicate the border of this and we will now see that. But, that's not always enough. Sometimes when I'm drawing something in 3D, I want to physically see that. So I'm going to open the drop-down window and select shaded. Okay, when I do that, I have this little hollow cube that I have extruded. Rendered is going to do, depending on the settings that you have on your rendering viewport, it's going to be a basic render. You can make Rhino actively attempt to render things, but unless you have a NASA computer, it's going to do that very slowly and impede your progress. I very rarely render things in Rhino anyways, but we're gonna talk about that in a minute too. Ghosted is exactly as it might seem or sound. I think the only difference between that and wireframe is that if I click in the middle of it here, I can't select the surface. I need to click on one of the edges. If we're on ghosted, we can see that there are surfaces, but we can also see through them and click on them. So that can be handy sometimes, but that's usually a drafting tool. If you're printing out a draft of a 3D object, then you would use this if there's some part of it that you need to see through and have some transparency. X-ray is very much similar, except there's zero opacity almost. Technical, similar to that, you might use this for a pattern drawing. It's going to automatically show lines that are behind a surface or a solid as dotted lines. Artistic is just kind of fun. Makes it look like it's on paper, so that can be neat. I suppose pen is similar. Looks like it's drawn with pen. Arctic is similar to rendering, but not the same. And ray traced is a now simplified rendering, but it's actively applying a ray traced render, which is a type of rendering shadows and reflections. But I've never had a reason to use any of that at all. So we've got those things. We've set up the program. We can draw simple stuff. We're familiar with some of the most powerful tools that Rhino has at its disposal. And I'm trying to think about what else I might interact with. In this right-hand toolbar here, we have a couple of different options, things that we can mess with. Layers are very important. Layers are just like layers in Adobe software. It's a pretty unanimous thing in programs like this. So, and it's exactly like you might think. We have one layer. We can make multiple layers. We can make sublayers, which will be a permanent part of a parent layer. We can change their color. Something that I often like to do is when I'm making fixtures, I will make a layer group and call it fixture. I'll use a red line for vacuum channels, a layer for gaskets, and then I'll use an additional one for vacuum holes. Okay, I like to make the gaskets green and blue for the vacuum holes. This can also be really helpful for anyone who might be colorblind or color deficient. The settings by default are not really friendly for that. Under our view, where we can modify like what color things are when they're selected, but I feel it's important to mention because many people are color deficient, and it can be very frustrating to interact with this program if you can't clearly see what it's doing. So consider that if you happen to be color deficient. So for instance, let's just draw a very crude fixture. I'll make a line that's 20 inches. Let's just say that our fixture is 20 inches by 10 inches. And again, I'm drawing this longhand because I can't help myself. I'll join these together, and then my gasket. Let's assume that my gasket has a total width of 1/8 of an inch. So I'll offset this by, at least 1/4 of an inch. Leave us a little bit of space. And then I'll get some vacuum channel stuff going on. Probably do the initial one the same distance, and then, a little bit more space. I've messed around a lot with fixture design over the years, and I used to be of the thought that we had to have a bunch of vacuum channels, but I found that not to be true. In fact, sometimes less is more, but then it's also important to connect them. I'm sure at some point we're going to do a video on fixture building and how I do that kind of thing, which might be difficult to communicate through the internet because I can't show you a fixture in real life. Or maybe for that video I'll have a camera on and I can actually show you one of the fixtures. That might be helpful. But anyways, point is here, doing this system of colors makes it really easy to identify what we're looking at. So boom, we have the beginnings of a fixture. If I wanted to actually model this to look like the fixture would, okay, that looks crazy. Why did that happen? Oh, that's why. Okay, so, well, that's a good thing to actually talk about. So I'm using network surface here to close up this little box. And when I did it initially, you saw that it was crazy. That's because the edge matching here was set up kind of crazy. I mean, that's not flat. That's not going to work for anybody. So setting everything to the loose position generally will make it flat and what I actually want it to be. I copy this to the top, and now I can join everything together and then maybe even group it. And now I have a model of a fixture. I generally don't tend to join and group them together, but for workflow, that can also be a good idea. Earlier in the video series, I mentioned, building things out in the program as if I was making them in real life, and that can, joining and grouping things together is an important part of that, because now I can simply interact with this entire thing as if it was one thing and move it around and do whatever it is I need to do with it. The next thing I feel I can talk about is rendering. So if we wanted to render something, let's go ahead and open a file. A guitar that I have been working on for an upcoming client is one of my Famine models. And in here I've got, well, you get a little window into what my design process is like, but which tends to be a little bit of a mess. I'm not shy about it, but sometimes that's what creativity is like, right? So rendering can be useful if you're wanting to communicate a final product. It's a little bit involved. Maybe I'll do a video just on this, but I wanted you all to see what it can look like if we do it properly. Now, Rhino is not as in-depth as something like Blender, of course. It works entirely differently and its purpose is entirely different. But what I've done with this was made some materials, as the program will call it, just using the stock stuff that's in Rhino. And you come down here, you can select the type of material that it's going to render it as, how glossy it is, what its color is. You can add some kind of texture to it. I generally keep this kind of thing to a minimum because I just want to take the model and communicate like a design and a color scheme. It doesn't have to look exactly like the end product is going to look. For me, that's just what I do. I know some people who take it much further than that, and there's a lot of utility to that as well. But when I have these materials that I've made, I want to apply it to a surface, and in this case, I'm trying to show purfling lines that I'm going to put. So I actually had to split all these surfaces up, but I can select a surface, right-click on the material that I want to add to it, and hit Assign to Objects. Now, when I go to rendered mode, I can see all of that. And actually, when I go to genuinely render it, and I hit Enter, we begin a render, then we see rendering, the final design. So, but I feel like that's a little bit off into the weeds. Rendering stuff is not really a basic function of Rhino, but I believe we've just about covered it. If you ever get lost, you can sort through these drop-down windows. All of these other things are pretty much related to just commands required to make a solid or a sub-D object, or lines or surfaces. However, if you are using a command and you're getting stuck, one of the coolest tools that Rhino has is we can enter in the command and hit enter, and then if we're really stuck or we want to learn more about it, we can hit F1, and by hitting F1, it will open your web page to Rhino's manual to the exact page for that command. Okay, so, and if anything that I mentioned was not clear, previously I've mentioned video tutorials. Rhino has all kinds of great stuff. They even talk about Grasshopper, which I mentioned earlier, which can be a really powerful tool. I've seen people do amazing things with Grasshopper that you wouldn't maybe necessarily expect. It's all in here. So I hope that what I shared was concise and helpful, but I want to encourage you to go to McNeil's website and check out their stuff and try out drawing some pretty basic shapes. For me, drawing basic shapes at first didn't work. I was chomping at the bit and just wanted to draw guitars, anything guitar related, even if it was just 2D objects. I was gonna, force my way through it and figure it out. But if that approach really doesn't work for you, all these resources here and everything I'm going to generate in the future, I think will get you much closer, much faster to making guitars, both in the virtual space as well as the real space, in less time than it would otherwise. And with that, I thank you again for joining me, and I will see you next time.